Picture a camel. You already have one in your head. Sand dunes stretching to the horizon, a caravan moving in single file, the sun low and orange behind it. That image is not an accident. Every camel you've ever seen in a photograph looks built for that exact landscape, as if the desert built it. It is the picture 200 years of paintings, postcards, and movies have handed you. Right now, roughly 35 million dromedary camels are alive on Earth. That's more than the entire population of Canada, on 4 legs. Almost every one of them lives in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, or the Middle East, exactly where you'd expect. They carry goods across the Sahara. They stand in the courtyards of desert tourist stops. They appear on money, on flags, on the sides of cigarette packs. Somewhere out there, you assume, wild versions of this animal still exist. Herds no human ever touched, roaming free the way wild horses still roam parts of Mongolia. A number that big feels permanent, fixed. That assumption feels safe. It feels obvious. It is also about to fall apart. But permanence is not what the record shows. Unlike horses, cattle, or dogs, no confirmed wild population of the dromedary camel has existed for centuries. Not one herd. Not one verified sighting in the wild. Every camel alive today, all 35 million of them, is domestic. So the real question isn't whether wild camels still exist somewhere out past the last town. It's narrower than that, and stranger. If scientists pulled DNA from a modern camel and compare it against DNA pulled from ancient bones buried in the desert floor, one population comes back as the match, not a guess. An answer, written into the genome itself, waiting to be read. Ancient DNA is fragile. Heat breaks it down, moisture breaks it down, and most environments destroy it within a few thousand years. But dry heat is different. In a place like the Arabian desert, low humidity can act almost like a natural freezer, and fragments of DNA can survive far longer than researchers once expected. In 2016, a team led by Faisal Almathan published a study in the journal PNAS that did exactly this. They pulled ancient DNA from camel bones excavated at Arabian archaeological sites, some going back 3,000 years, and set it against modern DNA sampled from dromedary populations spanning 3 continents, from North Africa through the Middle East to feral herds now living wild in the Australian outback. That's the scale. Thousands of years of bones on one side, a global spread of living animals on the other. Earlier attempts at this question had relied mostly on archaeology alone, digging up bone fragments and dating settlements, which could narrow domestication to a rough window on the map but couldn't prove ancestry. Bones can tell you when and where an animal died. They can't tell you whose child it was. DNA can. Comparing genomes works a little like comparing 2 copies of the same long letter, each recopied by hand for generations. Wherever the same small spelling mistakes show up in both copies, that's shared ancestry, not coincidence. The more matching mistakes, the closer the family tie. Every fragment recovered from those old bones had survived thousands of years underground, waiting. The DNA was just getting started. To understand what it was searching for, it helps to meet the rest of the family, because camels have relatives most people have never heard of. Start with the wild Bactrian camel, Camelus ferus, living today in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and China. Fewer than 1,000 of them remain, and they can drink water saltier than the ocean, a trick no domestic camel can match. Then there's the domestic Bactrian camel, the 2-humped camel familiar from the Silk Road, related to the wild Bactrian by name only, not necessarily by blood. Further out, in South America, live the guanaco and the vicuña, wild camelids that never crossed a desert in their lives. The guanaco is the wild ancestor of the llama. The vicuña is the wild ancestor of the alpaca, and its wool is so fine that a single vicuña can only be shorn once every few years without harming the animal. Neither the guanaco nor the vicuña has ever set foot in Arabia, and then there's a name almost nobody outside paleontology knows, Camelops, an extinct camel that once roamed North America until roughly 11,000 years ago, alongside mammoths and saber-toothed cats. Camelops matters because of where it lived. Camels, all of them, dromedaries included, did not begin in the desert at all. The whole family originated in North America more than 40 million years ago, long before any of them ever saw a sand dune in Arabia. Before any of these branches split apart, the earliest camelids were nothing like camels at all. One ancestor, called Pobratherium, stood about the size of a small deer, and lived across what is now the American West, more than 30 million years before a single camel crossed into Asia. That's the root of the whole camel family tree. Somewhere between 5 species, each one a different branch of the same tree, the true wild parent of the dromedary had to be hiding, or already gone. With that whole family laid out, one candidate stood above the rest as the obvious answer. If any of these animals carried the closest blood match to the domestic dromedary, logic pointed straight at the wild Bactrian camel. Same genus. Same continent of origin, more or less. A camel built for extreme conditions, just like the one running the length of the Sahara. Both species share thick fur for temperature swings, wide feet for soft ground, and the ability to go without water for days at a stretch. Researchers had every reason to expect the DNA to confirm it, cousins standing in for parent, the nearest living relative filling the role of ancestor. That was the prediction going in. Straightforward. Reasonable. The kind of result nobody would have questioned. And it's not what the DNA showed. The elimination started with the animals farthest away, and the guanaco and vicuña went first. Their lineage split from the Old World camels roughly 16.3 million years ago, back when the ancestors of today's camels crossed into Asia over the Bering Land Bridge. 2 entirely separate domestication stories followed from that split. The guanaco became the llama. The vicuña became the alpaca, prized for wool so fine that a single animal can only be sheared every few years without harming it. Neither one is a camel in the way the word usually gets used. South American cousins, not desert kin, ruled out. Next came camelops, the extinct North American camel that once shared the plains with mammoths and saber-toothed cats until roughly 11,000 years ago. This elimination carried the strangest fact of the whole search. The entire camel family, dromedaries included, did not originate in a desert at all. It began in North America more than 40 million years earlier, with small, deer-sized ancestors like Pobretherium roaming what is now the American West. Camelops was one of the last of that original continent's camels before the branch died out completely. A whole family born on one continent, ending up famous on another, ruled out but not forgotten. Then the domestic Bactrian camel, the 2-humped animal of the Silk Road. It shares a genus with the dromedary and a similar historical job, carrying goods and people across brutal terrain for thousands of years. But its domestication happened independently, in Central Asia, among a different founding population entirely. Same toolkit, different origin story. Ruled out. That left the wild Bactrian camel, Camelus ferus, the candidate every researcher expected to win. Fewer than 1,000 individuals survive today, tucked into the Gobi Desert, and they can drink water saltier than the sea, a trait no domestic camel shares. Genetically, it looked like the strongest match on paper, same genus as the dromedary, built for extremes. Then the mitochondrial and genome-wide data came back, and the picture didn't hold. Studies dating the split between wild and domestic Bactrian camels placed it around 1.1 million years ago, with some estimates closer to 700,000. 2 separate lineages, diverging long before either one had anything to do with a dromedary. Some analyses even suggest the wild Bactrian camel may not fully share a common maternal ancestor with its own domestic namesake, despite living in the same region today. Same name. Different family, in places. Ruled out. Cousin, not parent, and not even a close cousin at that. 5 candidates, 5 eliminations, none of them the source, which meant the animal that fathered 35 million camels wasn't standing in a desert anywhere on Earth right now. So the search turned away from the living world entirely. Researchers went back to the bones, to Bronze and Iron Age remains excavated from sites along the southeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, some more than 3,000 years old. They pulled what fragments of DNA had survived the heat and the centuries and set them against the genomes of modern dromedaries sampled across 3 continents. The match wasn't close, it was near identical. The closest genetic relative to every camel alive today wasn't found in a nature reserve. It wasn't found in a mountain range, or a protected herd, or a remote valley nobody had surveyed yet. It was found in the ground. The DNA traced back to a population of wild dromedary camels that once lived on the southeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, the same region archaeologists had already flagged as the likely site of domestication sometime between 1,500 and 1,000 BCE. That wild population is the true ancestor, not a cousin standing in for the role, not the wild Bactrian camel, not camelops, not any of the South American camelids. A specific, once-living group of wild dromedaries in a specific stretch of desert, confirmed by their own DNA, passed down into every camel walking the earth today. And that population no longer exists. It vanished a long time ago. Here is what makes that finding stranger than it first appears. Most domesticated animals follow a simple pattern. Humans capture a wild population, breed it in isolation, and the wild source either survives elsewhere or dies out shortly after, leaving the domestic line to drift on its own, genetically thinning with each generation. Cattle did this, horses did this, the dromedary did not. The 2016 study found evidence the researchers called restocking from the wild. Domestication didn't happen in one clean event followed by separation. After camels were first tamed, people kept crossbreeding their domestic herds with wild dromedaries, again and again, for centuries. The wild population and the domestic population overlapped and interbred long after taming began, not for a generation or two, but for roughly 2,000 years. That overlap solves a puzzle geneticists hadn't expected to find in the first place. Domesticated species almost always lose genetic diversity fast, squeezed through a narrow founding population. Dromedaries kept theirs unusually high, and now there's an explanation. They kept receiving fresh wild DNA long after the first camel was ever led on a rope. Then, roughly 2,000 years after domestication began, the wild source finally disappeared. Not before the story started, in the middle of it. The ancestor wasn't a starting point that vanished and left the rest to history. It was an active contributor for 2 millennia, quietly reshaping an animal it would never live to see spread across 3 continents before it went extinct for good. That extinction date didn't come from a lab alone, it came from the ground first. Zooarchaeologists digging at sites on the southeastern Arabian coast had already dated the earliest signs of camel domestication to somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 BCE, using nothing but bone deposits, butchery marks, and settlement layers. No DNA involved. Just shovels, patience, and careful stratigraphy. When the genetic timeline came back years later, it landed in the same region, in the same rough window. 2 teams, 2 completely different methods, converging on one answer without either one leaning on the other. The confirmation didn't stop at dates. Trade route archaeology across Arabia and into the Horn of Africa tracks a spread of camel remains and depictions that mirrors the genetic dispersal pattern researchers reconstructed from modern samples. Rock art, kill sites, and caravan stops all trace outward from that same southeastern pocket of the peninsula. Bones in the dirt, DNA in a sequencer. Neither one knew what the other had found, and neither one needed to. None of that is possible without a physical reason, and the reason lives in the genome. Sequencing efforts on the Bactrian camel put the full genome at roughly 2.38 billion base pairs, carrying close to 20,821 protein-coding genes, the most detailed camelid reference available. That genome also revealed just how far back this family really goes. Camels share a common ancestor with cattle, pigs, and deer from around 55 to 60 million years ago. Not a close relationship, a distant one. The dromedary and the Bactrian camel split roughly 1.1 million years ago, and in that time, each one built its own version of survival, independently on separate continents. Both carry adaptations tied to fat storage and water regulation, the biology behind the hump, and the ability to go days without drinking. But they arrived at similar solutions from different genetic paths, not a shared one. And the numbers on each side of that split tell their own story. Wild Bactrian camels number fewer than 1,000 today. Domestic dromedaries number roughly 35 million. One lineage nearly vanished. The other became one of the most successful partnerships between a human and an animal in recorded history. If you've ever ridden a camel on vacation, or watched one plod across a screen in a documentary about ancient trade, you were looking at the end product of that 2,000-year overlap, not a museum piece frozen in time. Every camel that has ever carried salt across the Sahara, every camel that has ever knelt for a photograph outside the pyramids, every camel standing in a market stall right now carries genes from an animal that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Not extinct before the story began, extinct in the middle of it, after generations of quietly shaping the outcome. Scientists went looking for a species and found something closer to a ghost, one that vanished only after leaving its signature in every camel alive today.